August 1943, Dobodura, New Guinea. Heat shimmered across the pierced steel runway, damp air already heavy with the day's promise of rain. Then it came, a sound like thunder on the horizon, the 18 cylinders of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 drumming against the jungle silence. The ground shook as the first Republic P-47 Thunderbolt appeared, its bulk blotting out the fragile trees along the strip. The men waiting knew instinctively. Something very different had arrived in the Pacific. Colonel Neel E. Kearby stood at the hard stand, watching with arms folded. A Texas drawl marked his speech, but calculation marked his eyes. He had flown everything the Air Corps gave him, but this was a new animal. The P-47 did not look like a thoroughbred fighter. Barrel-shaped, with a greenhouse canopy and wings that seemed too short, it looked clumsy compared to the sleek Japanese Oscars and the wiry P-40s that had fought here since 1942. Yet Kearby knew better than to trust appearances. The Jug, as its pilots already called it, carried 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns and a supercharged radial that could haul it into the high sky above 20,000 feet. It was, he suspected, not a duelist's blade, but a hammer. New Guinea was no place for delicate machines. Metal corroded in weeks, and anything left idle grew red with rust or green with mould. Engineers had hacked Dobodura's strips from swamp and jungle, filling holes with crushed coral, fighting heat and insects as if they too were enemies. In such a place, durability mattered as much as speed. The Thunderbolt was built to take punishment. Its rugged radial engine lacked coolant lines that a single bullet might pierce. Its fuselage was armoured like a fortress. Pilots were beginning to discover that the Jug could return home with holes that would have shredded lighter aircraft. Kearby climbed into the cockpit. Gauges crowded the panel. Manifold pressure, boost, cowl flaps, turbo controls. The turbo supercharger, mounted aft, fed the engine like lungs from another world. Pilots had to learn to step the turbo properly as they climbed, or risk losing the engine. But if handled right, the P-47 could fight in a realm where Japanese fighters gasped for oxygen. Above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt became something the Japanese had no answer for. Training at Dobodura was brutal but essential. Kearby drilled his men not to fly the Jug like a Spitfire or a P-40. Altitude was cash, speed was interest, and the 8 Brownings were how you spent both. He taught them to avoid turning fights with nimble Oscars and Tonys. Instead, climb high, dive hard, strike once, and climb away before the enemy could react. Don't fight their fight, he told them. Make them fight ours. Fuel remained the great limiter. Early Thunderbolts were thirsty, and the distances of New Guinea were unforgiving. Paper 108-gallon drop tanks extended range, but pilots had to manage every gallon. They cruised lean, jettisoned tanks before combat and trusted the Jug's weight to turn dives into killing passes. The mathematics of fuel and altitude shaped every mission plan as much as weather reports or enemy sightings. Across the sea, the Japanese fortified their great bastion, Wewak. 4 airfields, Boram, Wewak, Dagwa, But, lined the north coast. Whoever held them controlled the skies over New Guinea. Allied bombers struck them in August, cratering runways and burning aircraft, but the Japanese repaired tirelessly. Camouflage nets covered revetments, dummy aircraft appeared on dispersal areas, and barges brought drums of fuel at night. The fight for Wewak was not a battle, but a campaign of attrition. In the operations tent, Kearby studied reconnaissance photos until his eyes blurred. He traced runways with his finger, noted fuel dumps, memorized the pattern of shadows. Intelligence meant little without doctrine. For him, the doctrine was simple: gain altitude, keep speed, hit hard, never linger. The Jug was not about finesse. It was about delivering overwhelming force at the decisive moment. Late September brought the first real test. Morning skies cleared, and 3 Thunderbolts lifted from Dobodura, heavy with fuel and ammunition. At 22,000 feet, the coast unrolled beneath them. Borum's pale strip, Wewak hidden in the trees, Dagwa stretched along the sand. Dust rose where ground crews moved. The Americans rolled gently inverted and tipped into their dive, sun at their backs, gravity their ally. For a heartbeat, the jungle held still. Then the jugs fell like thunderbolts indeed, 8 Brownings each ready to speak at 6,000 rounds per minute. The Battle of Wewak had begun not with a clash of equals, but with the arrival of a machine designed for a different kind of war. In that moment, Colonel Neel E. Kearby understood that survival in New Guinea would not belong to the nimblest pilot, but to the side that mastered altitude, fuel, and firepower. September 1943, Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. Dawn crept slowly across the Owen Stanley Range, the jungle steaming under the first light. Engines coughed and roared as ground crews sweated in the thick air, arming and fueling Republic P-47 Thunderbolts for a mission that would push both machine and man to their limits. Colonel Neel E. Kearby, newly arrived group commander of the 348 fighter group, strapped into his jug and ran a practiced eye over his instruments. Today they would carry the fight to the Japanese airfields at Wewak. The situation was simple on paper and deadly in execution. The Japanese Fourth Air Army maintained over 200 aircraft along the north coast of New Guinea, concentrated at Borum, Wewak, Dagwa, and Butt. They threatened Allied supply convoys, bombed forward positions, and harassed bombers striking the northern coast. To neutralize them, the Allies had to bleed the garrisons dry, raid after raid, until fuel, machines, and men ran out. The Thunderbolts' arrival offered a new tool for that grim arithmetic. Kearby's plan was precise. 3 sections would climb over the ranges, cross the jungle canopy at 15,000 feet, and then spiral higher until they commanded the altitude over Wewak. Each jug carried full ammunition, 3,400 rounds across 8.50 caliber Brownings, and a belly-drop tank to stretch their range. They would jettison the tanks before engaging. Doctrine was clear. Altitude was survival, speed was life, firepower was victory. The climb was a battle before the battle. Heavy humidity robbed engines of power. Turbulence clawed at wings as the fighters clawed skyward. Sweat soaked flight suits. Yet the P-47s held their formation, lumbering upward until the sea flashed into view, blue and deceptively calm beyond the green coastline. Ahead, the faint scars of airstrips broke the jungle's grip. Borum first, then Wewak itself. Japanese sentries saw them too late. By the time sirens wailed and dust plumes rose, the Thunderbolts were already rolling inverted, sun flashing on canopies, wings biting the air as they tipped into their dives. Gravity accelerated them into killing speed, nearly 400 miles per hour. Kearby steadied his jug and picked his target, a line of parked fighters at the edge of Wewak's strip. The Brownings thundered, tracers stitched across revetments, fuel drums erupted in orange blossoms, and the fragile airframes of Ki-43 Oscars splintered under the barrage. Pilots sprinted from huts, some diving for their cockpits, others frozen by the storm of fire. The jugs screamed overhead, then pulled into steep climbs, their turbo superchargers howling. Behind them, the airfield boiled in smoke. That was only the beginning. At 20,000 feet, enemy fighters scrambled, Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys rising, nimble as hornets. Japanese pilots knew their advantage lay in maneuver, in tight turns and quick climbs. They cut upward into the attack, hoping to force the Thunderbolts into a dogfight. But Kearby had drilled his men. Never turn, never bleed speed. Dive, fire, climb away. Captain William Dunham, flying wing, spotted a Tony angling onto Kearby's tail. He rolled, dropped his nose, and unleashed a full burst. The Japanese fighter seemed to dissolve, its tail separating as flames erupted. Dunham zoomed upward, momentum carrying him clear. Hit and run, he reminded himself. Always hit and run. The fight expanded into the sky. Dozens of aircraft tangled over Wewak, contrails scratching white scars into the blue. Thunderbolts dove again and again, each pass another hammer blow. Japanese aircraft fell burning into jungle or sea, while the jugs roared away, climbing back to altitude. For the first time, the defenders realized they were not facing fragile P-40s, but armored giants that struck from above and could not be pulled into a turning match. Kearby scored his first confirmed kill that morning, an Oscar that tried to climb after him. The P-47's weight turned into power as he dove, guns firing at convergence distance. The Oscar disintegrated, wings tearing free. He pulled upward hard, feeling the controls stiffen, his altimeter spinning. A second target flashed ahead, another Oscar banking left. He rolled level, fired, and watched it erupt in smoke. 2 kills in minutes. The jug was proving itself. By the time fuel gauges dropped toward danger, the Thunderbolts regrouped. 4 Japanese fighters lay destroyed for the loss of 1 jug damaged, its pilot limping back south with coolant and oil streaming. The others turned for Dobodura, throttling back to conserve fuel, eyes alert for stragglers. Behind them, Wewak still burned. At debrief, pilots were exhausted, drenched in sweat, their voices hoarse. Yet the excitement was unmistakable. The jug had survived its trial by fire. The lessons were clear: never yield altitude, never linger, and trust in the armour and firepower of the Thunderbolt. In raw statistics, the raid was modest. But for the 348th Fighter Group, it was proof that they could challenge Japan's air arm directly and live. Colonel Kearby wrote in his combat report that evening, "The P-47, properly employed, is invincible at altitude. The enemy cannot match its dive, its firepower, or its resilience. Today's action demonstrates its capacity to dominate the skies when flown with discipline. This group will master it, and with it, break the enemy's hold on Wewak." The war in New Guinea had shifted. The Japanese still held their great bastion on the north coast, but now they faced opponents who no longer fought on equal terms. The P-47 was not graceful, but grace no longer mattered. Thunder, firepower, and relentless pressure would decide the campaign, and Neel Kearby was determined to deliver all 3. October 1943. Northeast New Guinea. The rains had broken, leaving the airfields at Dobodura slick with mud and the jungle steaming like a furnace. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, once mocked as ungainly brutes, now stood lined in hardstands, their olive-drab paint dulled by humidity, their Pratt and Whitney engines ticking as they cooled from the morning's training sorties. Each day, Colonel Neel E. Kearby's 348th Fighter Group grew sharper, more ruthless, and more confident in the doctrine he had hammered into them: altitude, speed, firepower. The Japanese still held Wewak, though their air garrisons had been savaged by successive raids. Reconnaissance photographs showed fewer aircraft clustered in revetments, but plenty of activity: new huts going up, damaged planes being patched, fuel drums stacked in neat rows under camouflage nets. To the American eye, it was a target-rich environment. To the Japanese, it was still a fortress, the shield over their North New Guinea bastion. The 2 visions were now on collision course. On October 11th, the 348th prepared for another strike. 24 Thunderbolts rolled down the steel matting, their engines roaring in unison. They carried external tanks for range, each lugging 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Their mission? Sweep the skies clear over Wewak while medium bombers struck the airfields. Kearby himself would lead. The climb over the Owen Stanleys was arduous. Thunderbolts strained upward, their turbo superchargers howling. At 20,000 feet, the coast revealed itself, a thin blue ribbon beyond the jungle. Pilots checked their fuel, trimmed their controls, and tightened formation. The jug was not a nimble partner, but in disciplined groups it became a wall of steel. Japanese spotters raised the alarm as the formation approached. Within minutes, Oscars and Tonys scrambled, their light frames leaping skyward with agility. They expected heavy bombers escorted by P-40s, the familiar pattern. Instead, they found jugs diving from 27,000 feet with the sun at their backs. Kearby rolled into his first dive. His target, a Ki-43 Oscar climbing desperately, wings flashing in the sun. The Brownings thundered, tracers converging at 300 yards. The Oscar came apart instantly, its fabric skin disintegrating under the torrent. Kearby pulled up sharply, his altimeter spinning, the jug climbing like a locomotive. Below him, chaos unfolded. Captain Dunham and Lieutenant MacDonald dove together, hammering a formation of Tonys. One enemy burst into flames, the pilot bailing out too low to survive. Another twisted in a tight turn, trying to draw the jug into a dogfight. MacDonald held discipline, zooming upward, then rolled inverted and dove again. His burst shredded the Tony's wing route, sending it cartwheeling into the jungle. The Japanese pilots were skilled, many veterans of China and the early Pacific campaigns. But they faced a new enemy, not just the machine, but the doctrine. Every time they tried to lure Thunderbolts into turning duels, the Americans refused. Instead, they used altitude as currency, diving and climbing, never lingering, never giving the nimble Oscars a chance to cut across their tails. Each pass was another hammer blow. Within 20 minutes, the sky over Wewak was littered with burning aircraft. 14 Japanese fighters fell confirmed, with several probables. The Thunderbolts returned with only 2 damaged, both able to limp back to Dobodura. For the Japanese ground crews, the sight was devastating. Wrecks smouldering across the jungle fringe, smoke trailing into the humid sky. The after-action debrief was electric. Pilots, still drenched in sweat and adrenaline, tallied their victories. Kearby himself claimed 3 that day, bringing his tally higher, though he spoke little of numbers. What mattered was proof. The jug had now dominated in a large-scale engagement. The Japanese, once confident masters of the New Guinea skies, were losing the initiative. Reports from the Japanese 4th Air Army confirm the shock. Captured diaries later recorded disbelief at the Thunderbolt's resilience. One pilot wrote, "I emptied my cannon into the American fighter. It smoked, but it kept climbing. It returned, and my wingman was gone." The myth of American fragility was dying as fast as aircraft burned on Wewak's strips. The Thunderbolt's weaknesses remained, however. Range was the constant enemy. Missions to Wewak stretched fuel limits. Several times jugs returned on fumes, engines coughing as they taxied in. Drop tanks leaked or failed, forcing aborts. Kearby pressed logistics officers for more reliable external tanks, knowing each lost sortie cost momentum. In war, mathematics mattered as much as valor. Tactically, the group was evolving. They learned to fly in stacked elements, with top cover at 25,000 feet, while diving sections attacked below. This provided security against ambush and ensured no Thunderbolt was ever left low and slow. The doctrine mirrored what had worked in Europe but adapted to the Pacific's distances and terrain. On October 23rd, Kearby led a mission that cemented his legend. With just 4 Thunderbolts, he engaged a formation of nearly 15 enemy fighters over Wewak. Using altitude and discipline, he dove again and again, personally claiming 6 victories in minutes. His combat report was clinical, but the feat electrified the 348th and earned him the Medal of Honor recommendation. For the Japanese, it was further confirmation that the jug, once ridiculed, had become a predator. That evening, as mechanics patched bullet holes and pilots wrote reports, Kearby addressed his men. His words were simple but carried weight. This war won't be won by turning fights or heroics. It'll be won by climbing higher, hitting harder, and coming home alive. The jug gives us that chance. Use it right, and it'll change the whole campaign. The Battle of Wewak was no longer an abstract campaign of attrition. It was becoming a proving ground for air power doctrine. The Thunderbolt had shown it could seize air superiority, not by matching the enemy plane for plane, but by rewriting the terms of engagement. Where once Japanese pilots mocked the flying milk bottles, they now feared the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines diving from the stratosphere. By late October, reconnaissance showed fewer Japanese sorties, fewer fighters parked at the revetments. Allied bombers began to strike deeper, with P-47s clearing the skies ahead. The tide in New Guinea's air war had shifted. Colonel Neel Kearby, with his faith in the jug and his doctrine of altitude and firepower, had become the architect of that change. But both sides knew the battle was far from over. Wewak still stood, scarred but functioning. Japanese convoys still threaded the Bismarck Sea by night, and the men of the 348th, though triumphant, faced months more of sweat, fuel shortages, and attrition. Yet for the first time, American pilots believed they held the advantage in the New Guinea skies. The jug had earned its place. The war of nimbleness was giving way to a war of power, and in that transition, Neel Kearby's Thunderbolts were ascendant. November 1943. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. The wet season clung stubbornly to the steaming jungles, and with it came new challenges for men and machines alike. Thunderbolts bogged down in mud, tents sagged under constant rain, and mechanics worked knee-deep in water pits. Yet the war did not pause for weather. Colonel Neel E. Kearby and his 348th Fighter Group pressed their campaign against Wewak, the Japanese bastion whose airfields had once guaranteed imperial control over northern New Guinea. Now, those same fields were being bombed daily, hammered until they were little more than cratered earth and smouldering wreckage. For the Japanese Fourth Air Army, the situation grew dire. Captured post-war diaries record pilots writing of exhaustion, fuel shortages, and the sheer terror of facing Thunderbolts again and again. "The big American fighter comes down from the sun," one entry lamented, "and there is no defense. Its guns roar like a storm." By early November, reconnaissance photographs revealed the cumulative effects of the campaign. Where once hundreds of aircraft had been dispersed around Wewak, only scattered formations remained. Still, the Japanese resisted fiercely, determined to blunt American momentum. On November 2nd, a large air battle erupted that became emblematic of the campaign's shift in balance. Kearby led 18 P-47s across the Owen Stanley Range. Their external tanks gave them endurance, but fuel margins remained tight. Climbing into the thin blue sky, they found the Japanese already airborne, nearly 30 fighters, a mix of Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys, circling in layered patrols. The engagement that followed tested every lesson Kearby had drilled into his men. The jugs struck first. Diving from 27,000 feet, they split into pairs, each pair choosing a target and committing to a high-speed pass. The Brownings thundered, streams of tracers ripping through the morning haze. 2 Oscars disintegrated instantly, their light frames no match for concentrated .50 caliber fire. Others attempted desperate turns, hoping to draw the jugs low and slow, but discipline held. American pilots refused the bait, climbing back to altitude for another strike. For 30 minutes the battle raged, a deadly ballet of dives, zooms, and hammering fire. By the time fuel forced the Thunderbolts to disengage, 12 Japanese aircraft were confirmed destroyed. The Americans lost none, though 2 jugs bore scars, holes stitched across wings and tails, hydraulic lines severed, but both returned to Dobodura intact. The mathematics of attrition were turning inexorably against Japan. In the aftermath, 13th Fighter Command compiled reports that highlighted a striking fact. The P-47's resilience was becoming legendary. One jug returned with over 180 bullet holes, its pilot shaken but alive. The mechanics patched it with sheet metal and sent it back aloft within a week. This ability to absorb punishment while delivering overwhelming firepower created a psychological edge as valuable as any tactical advantage. The Japanese war diary for November 2nd was grim. Our losses are unsustainable. Their planes dive like falling mountains, indestructible. We cannot stop them. For the first time, Japanese officers openly questioned whether Wewak could be held. Yet orders from higher command remained unchanged. Defend at all costs. Through November, the tempo of operations intensified. American medium and heavy bombers pounded Wewak's airstrips, while P-47s roamed ahead, sweeping the skies clear. Each mission tested logistics to the breaking point. Fuel convoys struggled through muddy tracks to keep the Thunderbolts flying. Spare parts were scarce, and ground crews cannibalized damaged aircraft to keep others operational. But despite the hardships, morale soared. Pilots now believed the air war was theirs to lose. On November 11th, Kearby himself led another daring sweep. With only 8 Thunderbolts, he intercepted a larger Japanese formation attempting to cover a convoy near the Sepik coast. Using altitude and surprise, his small force dove into the enemy, scattering them in minutes. Kearby claimed 4 victories, his men 3 more. The convoy limped on, but the Japanese escort was shattered. The action was noted in both American combat reports and captured Japanese logs as a turning point. Even heavily outnumbered, the Jugs could not be stopped. Recognition from higher command soon followed. General George C. Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, praised Kearby's tactics and results. "He has taken the heaviest fighter we have and made it into a scalpel," Kenny wrote in his diary. "Where the Thunderbolt flies with Kearby, the Japanese no longer hold the sky." For the Japanese, every engagement eroded both their numbers and their confidence. Veterans who had once fought over China and the Philippines were now gone, replaced by green pilots rushed into combat with minimal training. Against the disciplined altitude-speed tactics of the 348th, their inexperience showed. By late November, losses mounted faster than replacements arrived. Still, the cost to the Americans was not negligible. Each long-range mission strained men and machines. Pilots endured hours in cramped cockpits, eyes scanning constantly for threats, nerves taut. Mechanical failures forced occasional bailouts over jungle or sea. Rescues were mounted when possible, but some men simply vanished into the green expanse of New Guinea. These absences were felt keenly, reminders that even in triumph the price of air superiority was steep. The month closed with an unmistakable truth. Wewak was no longer a safe haven for Japanese aircraft. The once formidable base, with its multiple airstrips and hundreds of fighters, had been reduced to a bleeding liability. American dominance of the skies over northern New Guinea was nearly absolute. On the final day of November, Kearby addressed his men. Standing on the muddy strip at Dobodura, he spoke plainly. "We've broken their back here, but it's not over. Wewak is still theirs, and they'll fight for every inch. Remember this. It's not about who turns tighter or dives steeper. It's about who comes back alive and ready to fly again tomorrow. The Jug gives us that. Use it." As the sun set behind the Owen Stanleys, Thunderbolts gleamed in fading light, their broad wings scarred yet defiant. The Battle of Wewak had entered a new phase. From now on, the Japanese would fight from weakness, the Americans from strength. The tide in the skies over New Guinea was turning, and Neel Kearby's Thunderbolts were the spearhead of that transformation. December 1943. The campaign for Wewak had become more than a series of air battles. It was now a test of endurance, measured in gallons of aviation fuel, pounds of ammunition, and the stamina of pilots who lived at the edge of exhaustion. Colonel Neel E. Kearby's 348th Fighter Group had carved its place into the annals of the Pacific Air War, but every victory carried a price that the men of Dobodura felt deeply. Captured Japanese documents from the 4th Air Army reveal the magnitude of their losses. Between August and December 1943, they recorded more than 200 aircraft destroyed around Wewak. Pilots wrote of dwindling fuel stocks, of flying with only half-filled tanks, and of being ordered into combat against Thunderbolts with less than 50 hours of training. A Japanese officer interrogated after the war admitted, "We no longer controlled the air." The P-47 came like a hammer from above, and our men were sacrificed to delay the inevitable. The loss of Wewak's effectiveness as an airbase meant more than aircraft destroyed. It severed Japan's ability to shield convoys along the northern New Guinea coast. Barges carrying food and ammunition were now easy prey for Allied aircraft, forcing resupply attempts to occur at night under constant threat from American PT boats. For Kearby's men, operations became a daily routine of grind and risk. Every morning, the sound of R2800 radials shook the jungle as Thunderbolts clawed into the sky. Missions varied: bomber escort, fighter sweeps, and ground attack, but the tempo left little room for rest. Aircraft returned pocked with bullet holes, tires shredded from rough strips, and engines straining from tropical heat. On December 11th, the 348th launched a major fighter sweep over Wewak. 24 P-47s crossed the coast at 25,000 feet, diving on enemy fighters scrambling from Borum airfield. The first pass shredded 6 Oscars before they left the runway. Another flight strafed revetments, igniting fuel drums and detonating parked aircraft. By mission's end, American pilots claimed 15 destroyed in the air and another dozen on the ground. The cost? 2 Thunderbolts lost, 1 pilot rescued from the sea, the other never found. The men celebrated their success, but quietly marked the empty chairs at dinner that night. Colonel Kearby himself was relentless. Already awarded the Medal of Honor in October for shooting down 6 aircraft in a single mission, he continued flying as often as regulations allowed. His philosophy was simple: lead from the front. Men admired his courage, though some worried his aggressiveness would eventually prove fatal. "The colonel never asked us to do what he wouldn't," one pilot later recalled, "but he was willing to risk everything every time." In late December, Kearby flew a mission that exemplified his style. Leading 4 Thunderbolts over the Sepik Plain, he intercepted a formation of Ki-61 Tonys. Instead of withdrawing after a high-speed pass, he pressed the attack, chasing the Japanese down to treetop level. In the running fight that followed, he shot down 2 before his wingmen pulled him away, fuel gauges near empty. It was bold, decisive, and reckless in equal measure, the hallmark of his command. By Christmas, Dobodura was a study in contrasts. Pilots painted noses with grinning sharks or dice, personalizing their jugs with bravado that masked fatigue. Letters home spoke of triumphs, but also of friends lost, of nights broken by malaria, and of the endless drone of insects. Mechanics, unsung heroes, worked around the clock. They patched wings with sheet metal, coaxed failing engines back to life, and improvised parts from whatever could be found. Without them, the Thunderbolts would never have flown the next day. Aircraft losses, though lower than Japanese, still gnawed at the group. By year's end, the 348th had lost more than 30 pilots since arriving in New Guinea. Each loss reverberated through the tight-knit squadrons. Pilots pinned photographs of fallen comrades on hut walls, silent memorials that grew too quickly. By December's close, aerial reconnaissance showed devastation at Wewak. Craters scarred every runway, blackened hulks littered dispersal areas, and camouflaged revetments concealed only empty frames. Japanese units had begun withdrawing surviving aircraft to Hollandia further west, effectively conceding Wewak. The once formidable bastion was now a graveyard. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that the neutralization of Wewak marked the collapse of Japanese air power in northern New Guinea. Without air cover, their ground forces became isolated, vulnerable to the creeping Allied advance. For the 348th, December 1943 represented both triumph and toll. They had demonstrated beyond doubt that the P-47 Thunderbolt could dominate in the Pacific, just as it was beginning to do in Europe. Its combination of firepower, altitude performance, and resilience had shattered Japanese resistance over Wewak, Yet behind every victory statistic was a story of exhaustion, sacrifice, and resilience. Kearby himself reflected in a letter home late that month. "We are winning here, though the price is high. The jug has proven itself again and again. I only hope I can do as much for her as she has done for me and my men." As 1944 loomed, the men of the 348th knew their campaign was far from over. New Japanese bases waited further west, and fresh battles would test them again. But for now, at Dobodura, they allowed themselves a moment of satisfaction. The Battle of Wewak had been fought and won in the skies, and the Thunderbolt had carried them through. When pilots raised their Christmas cups, they toasted not only to absent friends, but also to the ungainly machine that had become their salvation. The P-47 was no longer a newcomer to the Pacific. It was the hammer that broke Wewak, and with it, the back of Japanese air power in New Guinea. January 1944. The new year dawned with monsoon rains pounding the Dobodura strips, turning runways into rivers and tents into sodden shelters. The war did not pause for weather. Even as lightning cracked over the Owen Stanleys, missions went out daily, the Thunderbolts carving paths through cloud toward enemy strongholds. For Colonel Neel E. Kearby and his 348th Fighter Group, the tempo of operations promised no relief. The Japanese were retreating westward, but their spirit remained unbroken. Every mission carried the risk of sudden ambush. With Wewak neutralized, Allied command turned its attention to Hollandia and Hansa Bay, the next great bastions along the northern coast. Reconnaissance flights revealed fresh construction, long runways carved into jungle, new fuel dumps camouflaged beneath palms, revetments filled with Oscars, Zeros, and the newer Key 61 Tonys. The Japanese had learned from Wewak, dispersing their aircraft widely and improving anti-aircraft defences. Yet the pattern was clear. The Thunderbolts would strike again and again until resistance broke. Kearby relished the challenge. He pressed for aggressive fighter sweeps, convinced that maintaining pressure would keep Japanese pilots off balance. "Hit them before they're ready," he told his men, "and they'll never recover." On January 9, 1944, intelligence reported a build-up of enemy aircraft near Hansa Bay. Kearby volunteered to lead the mission himself. Accompanied by 4 Thunderbolts, he climbed into the grey skies at dawn, carrying the weight of both command and ambition. The medal he had earned months earlier only sharpened expectations. To his men, he was not just a commander, but a living legend. The formation crossed the coast at 27,000 feet, sunlight piercing breaks in the monsoon clouds. Below, the emerald coastline curved toward Hansa Bay, where smoke rose from cooking fires and camouflaged revetments. Japanese spotters had seen them. Fighters scrambled from the strip, silver dots rising into the haze. Kearby rolled inverted, signalling the attack. The dive was like a stone falling from heaven. The P-47s roared down at over 400 miles per hour, 8 Brownings each spitting fury. Kearby's guns stitched across a Kai 61, shattering its canopy and sending it spiralling into the jungle. His wingmen struck others, claiming 2 more. Yet the sky filled quickly with enemy aircraft, Oscars darting like swallows, Tonys climbing with desperate resolve. The melee spread across altitude bands, tracers lacing the air. Kearby pursued a Tony down to 10,000 feet, ignoring radio calls to break away. His instinct was always to press the attack, to finish what he started. The Tony twisted through clouds, diving toward the coast. Kearby stayed glued to its tail, firing bursts that chipped away at its tailplane. But the pursuit dragged him lower, closer to Japanese guns. Flak began to blossom around him, black puffs marking the sky. His wingmen, higher above, lost sight of him in the chaos. They fought their own battles, downing 2 more enemy aircraft but struggling to regroup. When the sky cleared, Kearby's Thunderbolt was gone. Reports later pieced together fragments of his fate. A Japanese war diary from the 68th Sentai recorded a P-47 being downed near Wewak that day, pursued by Ki-43s. Villagers later described a great silver aircraft crashing in the jungle, its engine roaring until the last moment. For months, uncertainty haunted the 348th. No pilot saw him fall, no parachute was sighted. Kearby had simply vanished into the green void of New Guinea. Back at Dobodura, the news spread like wildfire. Pilots gathered silently in the operations tent, staring at the empty space on the board where his name had hung. Some refused to believe it. Others accepted grim reality. "The colonel finally met the odds," one muttered, voice heavy with sorrow. His loss struck deeper than any before, for he embodied their spirit. Captured Japanese officers later spoke with respect of Kearby. One pilot admitted, "We knew of the American colonel who always led from the front. His attacks were fearless. Many of our comrades died to him. When we heard he was lost, some felt relief. He was an enemy, but one we honoured." Such testimony reflected the peculiar fraternity of airmen, adversaries who nonetheless recognized skill and courage. In the months following his disappearance, the 348th carried on the fight. New leaders stepped up, tactics refined, missions continued. But the memory of Kearby lingered like a shadow. His Medal of Honor mission, his relentless aggressiveness, his refusal to yield, all became touchstones for the group's identity. The official record credits him with 22 aerial victories, though some historians argue the number may be higher. What mattered more than statistics was the example he set, that a Thunderbolt, flown with skill and audacity, could dominate even in the most hostile skies. By December 1944, Allied forces had leapt beyond New Guinea, landing at Leyte in the Philippines. The 348th went with them, carrying the war ever closer to Japan. Yet in quiet moments, pilots still spoke of their colonel. Around campfires or over tin cups of coffee, they recalled his booming laugh, his relentless drive, and his belief that air power could shape victory. A letter found among his effects, never sent, perhaps captured his essence best. "I don't know if we'll live to see the end of this, but if these jugs give us half a chance, we'll make it happen. The boys fly with courage enough to match any I've known. If I fall, I hope they keep pushing until the job's done." The job was done in time. Japan's air power withered under the combined assault of Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Liberators. The skies belonged to the Allies. Yet the story of Neel E. Kearby remained inseparable from the jug he championed, and from the men who carried his memory into every sortie. His reckoning was final, but his example endured. March 1944. The skies over New Guinea grew quieter, though the war itself did not relent. Colonel Neel E. Kearby's loss lingered like an open wound, yet the 348th Fighter Group pressed forward, their Thunderbolts taking the fight deeper into enemy territory. His absence was felt in every briefing, every takeoff roll, every dogfight where pilots instinctively sought the familiar silver jug that had once led them. Yet from the silence, his legend only grew stronger, an echo shaping the men who carried on. The official word arrived weeks after his disappearance. Colonel Neel E. Kearby, missing in action. Paperwork offered closure, but the men knew it was only ink. No grave, no wreckage, no final salute. For many, the jungle itself seemed to have swallowed him whole. The army confirmed him as presumed dead, but among his group, belief in his survival flickered long after. Some whispered that he had bailed out and joined guerrillas in the mountains. Others imagined him captured, waiting out the war in some hidden prison. Hope sustained them, though reality pressed harder each month. Yet war could not afford indulgence. The 348th gained new leadership under Colonel Jared V. Crabb, a steady hand less flamboyant than Kearby, but respected for discipline and tactical clarity. Crabb carried forward Kearby's aggressive doctrine while tempering it with caution. "Don't throw lives away for numbers," he told his squadrons. "We'll beat them by surviving to fight tomorrow." Under Crabb, the P-47 shifted increasingly toward fighter-bomber missions. With the Japanese retreating west, their supply lines stretched thin, vulnerable to interdiction. Thunderbolts now roared low over jungle trails, their 8 Brownings tearing apart convoys, while bombs and rockets smashed depots and bridges. The big radial engines, once thought unsuited for the tropics, proved hardy in the heat and rain. The Jug was no longer just an air-to-air terror, it had become flying artillery. Statistics told the story. Between March and June 1944, the 348th flew over 3,000 sorties, destroying hundreds of trucks, dozens of barges, and more than 50 enemy aircraft on the ground. Ammunition expenditure soared into millions of rounds. Bombs dropped into thousands of tons. The numbers dwarfed the group's earlier months, reflecting both growing experience and widening strategic reach. Yet behind every figure lay the memory of the man who had shown what the Jug could do when flown with audacity. Captured Japanese pilots and officers, interrogated after their capture, often mentioned Kearby by name. Some did not know he was gone. The American with the heavy fighter, always at the front, he was dangerous, one recalled. When we saw the big Thunderbolts dive, we thought of him. Others described their shock at the Thunderbolt's durability. "Our cannon exploded against it, but still it flew," a Ki-43 pilot testified. Even as Allied intelligence confirmed Kearby's fate, his shadow loomed large across enemy testimonies. Japanese diaries reflected despair at the shift in air war. A sergeant with the 68th Sentai wrote in April 1944, "We are told to intercept, but these American fighters are too many, too strong. They shoot our aircraft to pieces, then return the next day as if nothing happened. We have courage, but courage is nothing against steel and firepower." Such words echoed the truth Kearby had embodied, that industrial might and aggressive doctrine had broken the balance. Though bereft of their original commander, the 348th became one of the most decorated fighter groups in the Pacific. Pilots like Gerald Johnson, Charles MacDonald, and Robert Basseler carried forward the fight, each adding to the group's tally of victories. MacDonald, in particular, would later achieve ace status, his style less reckless, but no less lethal. "We flew in his shadow," he admitted years later. "Every time we dove, I thought of how he taught us. Altitude, speed, firepower, that was his gift to us." By mid-1944, the group transitioned from New Guinea to the Philippines campaign, leapfrogging westward with MacArthur's advance. They carried with them not only their Thunderbolts, but also Kearby's doctrine. In the skies over Leyte and Luzon, his teachings bore fruit. P-47s smashed Japanese airfields, cut supply routes, and duelled enemy fighters with the same ferocity that had defined their colonel. In June 1944, word of Kearby's Medal of Honor circulated widely, though he had already been lost. The citation described his lone attack on a formation of enemy aircraft, his destruction of 6 in a single mission, and his extraordinary courage. To his men, it was both honor and sorrow. The medal formalized what they already knew, that he had been exceptional. But it also froze him in time, forever the daring colonel who pressed attacks no matter the odds. The 348th painted his name on the nose of a Thunderbolt, a flying memorial that roared into combat daily. Pilots wrote his initials in logbooks, carved them on tent poles, spoke them in briefings. He was no longer just a leader, but a legend, woven into the identity of the unit. When the war ended in 1945, survivors of the 348th gathered to reflect. Some returned to Texas to meet Kearby's family, sharing stories that preserved him beyond statistics. At reunions, men who had flown hundreds of missions still spoke of the day they first saw him climb into a Jug, confident and fearless. In their telling, he never truly died. He remained forever airborne, leading dives against impossible odds. The jungle eventually yielded part of the truth. In 1948, wreckage believed to be his P-47 was located near Wewak, twisted metal among vines. Confirmation closed the record, but to those who had flown under him, closure was unnecessary. His story had already passed into the fabric of memory. Colonel Neel E. Kearby's story was not only about one man, but about the transformation of air war in the Pacific. His embrace of the P-47 Thunderbolt, his aggressive tactics, and his relentless drive reshaped how the Allies contested the skies. Even in absence, his spirit guided the 348th Fighter Group from New Guinea to the Philippines. The echoes of his example persisted in every mission where pilots relied on altitude, speed, and firepower to carry the day. The colonel was gone, but the thunder of his jug still rolled across the Pacific. Late 1944, early 1945. The war had moved on from the steaming jungles of New Guinea, but the lessons learned over Wewak travelled with the men who had survived it. The 348th Fighter Group, once the newcomer at Dobodura, with mud on its boots and doubt in its throat, now wore confidence like a second uniform. They strapped into their Thunderbolts on new steel matting, first at Nadzab and Saidor, then through the leap to Sansapor and finally into the Philippines, dragging the front line forward with every sortie. The jug's broad wings threw shadows across new islands, but the sound it made was the same. The steady, unforgiving thunder of a nation's industry turned into velocity and fire. The campaign arc bent westward on a string of airheads and anchors. Engineers hacked runways from coral and mangrove, Seabees laying steel with the urgency of men who knew the next convoy depended on it. Supply ships disgorged drums, crates, and the million humble parts a fighter war consumes. The 348th's tents looked different, the names on their rosters not the same, yet every briefing still began with the catechism Colonel Neel E. Kearby had drilled into them: altitude, speed, firepower. The colonel was gone, but the doctrine remained. In the Philippines, the stakes turned personal. Many of the men had memorized MacArthur's promise as if it were scripture: "I shall return," and they were determined to make it true one sortie at a time. Leyte's air was a furnace, and its storms came like fallen cloaks, sudden and drenching. But the mission set was clear: smash the Japanese airfields that could threaten the beachheads, then strangle their shipping. The jug, ungainly on paper, was perfect in practice. Its radial shrugged off small arms fire on treetop runs. Its 8 Brownings planed sides off trucks. Its 500-pounders folded revetments like cardboard. The fighter that had seized the heights over Wewak now bullied the low places with equal authority. By December 1944, the 348th flew from Tacloban and Dulag, rough strips whose mats clanged under rolling tyres. Pilots learned the scent of wet coconut husks burning in village cook-fires, the look of lightning stitched across a black wall of rain. They learned, too, that the enemy in the Philippines was more desperate than the one in New Guinea, where Wewak's fighters had risen to contest the heights and fallen in disciplined defeat. Luzon and Leyte produced kamikaze runs against shipping, low-level ambushes from hidden strips, and flak rings thick as orchards around every important target. The Thunderbolt met that desperation with overmatch. On convoy interdiction missions north of Leyte Gulf, jugs flew in staggered pairs, one element ripping at barges with guns while the other slashed the escorting gunboats' decks. The .50 caliber API and API-T rounds chewed wood, steel, and flesh without distinction, and the jug could loiter long enough to make sure nothing that floated remained useful. When weather closed in at altitude, the old Wewak trick still worked: climb until the air thinned to honesty, then drop like a hammer wherever a contrail or a glint betrayed an enemy. They flew a different geometry now, across broader seas. Navigation became a craft of lines and faith, ADF needles trembling, drift corrected by instinct, landmarks learned like faces. A squadron could ride a cloud street from Leyte to Mindoro and arrive with fuel to fight, because logisticians back at Sansapor or Finschhafen had done their own mathematics. Tankers unloaded by tide tables, drums rolled by hands that never saw combat, octane poured from ship to truck to tank to wing, as if the whole Pacific were a single machine with many valves. The 348th carried its dead forward, the way fighter outfits do, on painted cowlings, in nicknames rolled across fuselages, in briefings that began with a memory before they returned to the mission at hand. Somewhere over the Sepik plain, a wrecked jug slept beneath vines, and the man who had made the P-47 a creed in New Guinea rested with it. Yet in every dive that began 1,000 feet above the enemy's sight picture, in every 2-second burst at 300 yards, his voice rode in the wind. Don't turn, don't loiter, spend your speed like money, and climb back to the bank. On Luzon, the group's pilots learned new names to hate and master. Clark Field, Nichols, Nielsen, and the dispersal strips near Florida Blanca, where camouflaged Tonys slunk under nipper canopies. They learned, too, to respect a different adversary in the air, the Ki-84 Hayate, faster and better climbing than the Oscar, with teeth to match. The jug could not dance with it, but it didn't need to. Altitude and angles still ruled physics. One veteran explained it to a replacement as they leaned over a map freckled with grease pencil. Think of the sky as a hill. We start higher on the hill. They run uphill to meet us. That's the fight. The rest is just bookkeeping and nerve. The bookkeeping grew brutal in January 1945 as Thunderbolts wheeled into the Luzon campaign at full stride. 3 ship elements raked train yards at Cabanatuan and San Fernando. Oil tanks at Batangas went up in woolly black roses, and bridges on Route 3 vanished into dust and rebar with satisfying regularity. Claims mounted, trucks shredded, locomotives burst, sampans immolated under tight hammering passes where wingmen counted to 2 and rolled away. The jug became the sound of certainty in a country that had been forced to endure 3 years of fear. In every tent, letters told the story the way reports could not. One pilot wrote home that the Filipinos waved as the Thunderbolts raced the sugar fields, hats brandished, children jumping in the wake of dust. Another confessed that he sometimes heard the roar of his own engine in dreams and woke with his hand already reaching to set prop and mixture by phantom touch. A crew chief described pulling a bullet from a cylinder fin like a thorn from a paw, the engine running smoother after, the airplane somehow grateful. When the 348th moved to San Marcelino and then to Florida Blanca, the war felt suddenly close and old and nearly finished all at once. The group's scoreboards filled with a different currency now, sorties flown, tons dropped, bridges cut, and the air-to-air numbers, though still respectable, mattered less than the absence of Japanese contrails above Allied convoys. Superiority had become supremacy, an unspoken condition of the sky. The jug had helped make it so. Near the end, on a clean blue March morning that smelled faintly of burned avgas and wet grass, a flight lead briefed a rail yard strike and paused. "When it's time to go," he said, "climb hard and don't watch your work too long. That's when flak finds you. That's when luck feels owed a debt." No one needed to ask where he'd learned that line. It had travelled across water and time, from a Texas voice at Dobodura to 100 cockpits over the Philippines. Victory crept in rather than arriving whole. The men noticed it in the way the radio grew quiet on Longlegs home, in the way the ops board posted fewer dawn scrambles and more deliberate sweeps, in the way mechanics had time to safety wire a line properly, instead of bodging it with safety pin and prayer. They noticed it, too, in the looks of villagers who had stopped searching the sky for bad news and started waving as the jugs drummed past. The thunder that had once meant fear now meant company. When at last the shooting dwindled and the maps unfurled beyond Luzon toward Formosa and the home islands, the 348th could look back across a track of islands, Dobodura to Sansapor to Tacloban to Clark, and see a line drawn by 8 Brownings and stubborn doctrine. Wewak, once a fortress, had been the hinge. Beyond it the door swung open. A colonel who would never come home had shown them how to turn the handle and push. After the war, some returned to farms or classrooms, others to the peacetime Air Force, all of them carrying the same private museum. A smell of hot oil and cordite, a sight picture frozen over a receding wing route, a voice that said 2 seconds is enough and meant it. At reunions, they told the story in measured sentences that hid awe behind habit. They spoke of a machine that should not have flown like it did, and of a man who refused to fly it any other way. They said, finally, what the records already knew, that the Battle of Wewak had not only broken a Japanese bastion, but had also made a fighter group and proven a fighter. The Jug had taken the worst the tropics could throw and answered with steel and mathematics. The men had done the same, and somewhere on the long road west, when another strip of pierced steel glittered in sun and the air smelled of new-cut grass and hot aluminum, they heard again the first distant roll of an R-2800 and smiled without meaning to. The thunder had come a long way, and it had left its echo everywhere it went. September 1943. The skies over New Guinea bore the marks of months of relentless combat. The Battle of Wewak had raged through late summer, reshaping the balance of air power in the southwest Pacific. Colonel Neel E. Kearby, commander of the 348th Fighter Group and pioneer of P-47 Thunderbolt tactics in the theatre, now stood at a crossroads. The campaign that had begun with tentative clashes in the humid skies over Wewak had evolved into a brutal demonstration of industrial might, tactical innovation, and human endurance. By the campaign's end, the Japanese air arm in northern New Guinea was a shadow of its former self, and Kearby's legend was sealed into the very fabric of U.S. Army Air Force's history. By mid-September, Allied intelligence estimated that the Japanese Fourth Air Army had lost more than 200 aircraft over the course of repeated strikes and intercepts. Interrogations of captured pilots later confirmed these estimates. The Japanese 68th Sentai, once a formidable force of Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusas, reported losing 3/4 of its operational strength in August alone. The 11th Sentai, equipped with the newer Ki 61 Hien, was reduced to flying patched-up remnants scavenged from wrecks. Morale plummeted. Fuel shortages and the collapse of supply routes from Rabaul meant even surviving aircraft often sat grounded. In contrast, the 348th Fighter Group, though bloodied, had grown stronger. Its pilots, once inexperienced with the Thunderbolt, had now mastered the heavy fighter's quirks. They understood its dive and zoom strengths, its durability under fire, and the overwhelming killing power of its 8.50 caliber Brownings. Losses had been sustained, 22 pilots killed or missing during the Wewak campaign, but replacements flowed in, bringing the group back to full strength within weeks. Kearby's relentless emphasis on discipline, gunnery precision, and altitude advantage meant the Thunderbolt squadrons were no longer seen as interlopers from a different war, but as decisive tools of Pacific strategy. For Colonel Kearby, Wewak was not just a campaign, but a proving ground for his belief that the P-47 could dominate even in the Pacific's vast distances. Critics in Washington and Brisbane had argued for lighter, longer-ranged fighters, dismissing the Thunderbolt as ill-suited for the theatre. But Kearby's victories silenced them. His 22 confirmed kills by the end of September 1943 made him the leading American ace in the Southwest Pacific, surpassing even Richard Bong's tally at that moment. His combat reports from Wewak read like a manual of energy fighting: steep diving attacks, deflection shooting, rapid disengagement, and ruthless exploitation of altitude. Time and again, Kearby's squadron ambushed Japanese formations, scattering them with withering fire. On September 15th, during a sweep near Wewak, Kearby personally downed 3 Ki-43s in under 5 minutes, each falling in flames after brief bursts of fire. In his after-action statement, he wrote simply, "Thunderbolt climbs better than they think. If you dive with speed, they never recover." But even as his tally grew, Kearby remained restless. Fellow pilots described him as driven, sometimes obsessed, with demonstrating the Thunderbolt's supremacy. He volunteered for missions other commanders would have delegated, leading from the front in every major sweep. Lieutenant Gerald Johnson later recalled, "He wasn't reckless, but he carried a weight. He wanted to prove something, to the brass, to the Japanese, maybe to himself." Captured Japanese records and post-war interrogations paint a grim picture of how Wewak broke their air arm. Lieutenant Haruo Araki of the 68th Sentai, interrogated in 1945, remembered, "We could not understand their planes. The big ones, they came from above, very fast, shooting fire that tore our aircraft to pieces. We called them Jusen, heavy fighters. Our 20mm shells often hit, but they kept flying. It was hopeless." The diary of Captain Masao Matsuda, recovered from a wreck near Butt Airfield, echoed the same despair. "Every mission is death. The enemy has many planes. They are faster in the dive, stronger in the climb. We wait for reinforcements that do not come. Wewak is the grave of the Army Air Force." For Japanese ground troops, the Thunderbolts were equally terrifying. Strafing runs shredded convoys, destroyed warehouses, and set fuel dumps ablaze. Survivors later testified to the psychological toll of P-47s thundering overhead, their 8 guns spewing destruction across every road and clearing. "We feared the big planes more than bombs," one infantryman admitted. "At least bombs fell quickly. The guns of the heavy fighters went on and on." The Battle of Wewak also revealed the industrial disparity that defined the Pacific War. During the campaign, Lockheed's California plants continued to roll out P-38s, while Republic's factories on Long Island produced over 500 P-47s per month. Each Thunderbolt delivered to the Pacific carried the labor of thousands of American workers, and each one replaced losses in weeks. In contrast, Japan's dispersed and resource-starved aircraft industry produced fewer than 100 modern fighters in New Guinea's support window. Logistical reports showed the scale. US forces delivered 2.5 million gallons of aviation fuel to New Guinea bases in August 1943 alone, while Japanese depots at Wewak rationed daily fuel to as little as 20 gallons per aircraft. Allied convoys carried bombs, ammunition, and spare parts in abundance. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, often flew with limited ammunition, and replacement parts were scavenged from wrecks. On October 11, 1943, just weeks after the height of Wewak, Kearby led one of his most famous missions, a sweep near Rabaul, where he and his wingmen engaged nearly 40 Japanese aircraft. In the furious dogfight, Kearby personally downed 6 enemy planes, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. But for Kearby, it was further proof of what the P-47 could achieve when handled with skill and aggression. The Medal of Honor placed him among the most celebrated American aces, yet those who knew him best said it did little to temper his determination. He remained focused on pushing his squadron harder, flying more sorties, and carrying the war deeper into enemy skies. The Battle of Wewak marked the turning point for Japanese air power in New Guinea. By the end of 1943, Allied air supremacy was unchallenged. The Thunderbolts of the 348th Fighter Group had demonstrated that even in the Pacific, the heavy American fighter could devastate enemy air and ground forces alike. Wewak became a case study in the marriage of industrial capacity and tactical adaptation. For Colonel Neel E. Kearby, it was the height of his career. He had proven his aircraft, led his men with distinction, and carved his name into aviation history. Yet fate remained cruel. On March 5, 1944, during a mission near Wewak, Kearby's Thunderbolt was brought down by Japanese fighters. He bailed out but did not survive. His body was not recovered until 1948. His Medal of Honor and the legacy of Wewak remained as enduring testaments to his skill and sacrifice. The story of Colonel Neel E. Kearby and the Battle of Wewak encapsulates the brutal arithmetic of industrial war. Courage, skill, and tactical brilliance mattered, but they were magnified, or rendered meaningless, by the weight of production, logistics, and firepower. In Wewak's skies, the Thunderbolt roared as a symbol of that reality, a machine mocked for its bulk that proved unmatched in durability and destruction. For the Japanese, Wewak was a graveyard. For the Americans, it was a proving ground. For Neel Kearby, it was both triumph and epitaph. The heavy fighter he championed left an enduring lesson. In modern war, air supremacy is not merely a matter of tactics, but of overwhelming, sustained capacity. The legacy of Thunderbolt thundered across New Guinea, leaving behind silence and history.